I think Yumiglorb would actually be more interesting if instead of a swirl damage buff based on your EM during your E, she increased her EM by a percentage. Like, increase your EM by 40%. Because what makes Swirl an interesting reaction to begin with is the way it can interact with chain reactions. And the fact that Yumiglorp's passives don't actually increase the chain reaction damage, it only increases the swirl damage, is kind of boring. Because it means that... Because you don't care about a swirl team's... Like, swirl doesn't become more interesting when you don't trigger chain reactions. It becomes less interesting. But, like, imagine Yumiglorp, but instead of buffing your swirl damage by, whatever, 400% of her EM, she increased your whole team's EM by 40% while her E was active. And then you try to play her with, like, just Sucrose. Well, kind of, but, like, with much... You'd want them to be much bigger numbers. And then you'd try to build teams around chain reactions a lot more. And that could be really cool. The problem with Yumiglorp's design is that Swirl as a reaction without chain reactions is very boring. It's not a bad reaction, but it's boring. And... yeah. Is Mizuki okay as an STD character? Standard. I get it. Standard character. Right, that makes more sense. Yeah, she's honestly, like... If we look at the standard characters we have, right? We have Jean, Diluc, Chi-Chi, Mona, Kutsing, Dehya, and Tirnari, right? Nowadays, Jean is a unit that's, like, fine because of her ability to consolidate healing with VV. But we also have other units that also do that, and they tend to be better, which hurts Jean a bit. And so she's a sort of unit that's, like, she's fine because the things she provides are valuable, but she's not all that great at anything. Diluc is honestly pretty damn bad. Like, yes, Plunge Diluc is a thing, but, like, Plunge Diluc is, like, 5% better than Plunge Féminin. It's not like Diluc is necessary to an account that wants to play a Plunge team with Xianyuan. So Diluc is pretty bad, I'd say. Chi-Chi's pretty awful. Mona keeps trying to sneak back in, right? Like, she almost has a good Molani team. She almost has a good Chasca team. She almost has a good Mawika team. But they're just not good enough. The thing is, like, in order to truly understand Mona, you have to compare her to Citlali, right? When you look at Mona and Citlali, they're both catalyst characters that give you damage percent and a bit of elemental application, right? Mona gives you a bit more damage percent than Citlali does, but doesn't have Shred, and so in general, her buff is much lower. And then on top of that, it's much lower uptime. You don't get a shield. The application is unreliable. The application doesn't last as long. The energy generation is something that happens off field, so she can't catch her own particles. The amount of particles is lower. Like, there are so many ways in which Citlali is just outright better than Mona. And it truly makes you realize, like, yeah, even if everything goes right with Mona, she's still not a good unit, right? Even if you manage to play TTDS Mona and still have enough ER somehow, Even if you're doing some fucking weird instructor TTDS Mona and somehow you manage to build 400 more billion ER on instructor, even if all of that happens, she's still worse than other supports nowadays. The other units that are, you know, numerically worse than Citlali often have something to make up for it. Right? You look at teams that use Citlali for like Mawika, Arlecchino, Gaming, Diluc, right? And you look at how they perform when you use a different older unit. When you look at the performance with Farina, Farina has more personal damage. You look at with Yelan, tends to be easier to line up your reactions. You look at with Xingqiu, also easier to line up your reactions and resistance to interruption, or not resistance to interruption, but damage reduction, which is actually better defensive utility for Mawika than Citlali's shield, because Citlali's shield isn't that big, and an attack that one-shots you with Xingqiu will also one-shot you through Citlali's shield. And if it's attacks that don't one-shot you, Xingqiu is always going to be better defensively than a shield. If you have a healer on your team, which you do, because Bennett. Anyways, I don't want to get into more fucking Xingqiu glazing today, alright? But the point I'm making is, like, Mona is a character that's supposed to trade quality of life for more power. But that's, like, more power in the context of the game in 1.0 when 5 stars weren't very good. And nowadays, even the units that have better quality of life also provide more output. So there's just no real reason to go for Mona, almost ever. So all SCDs are bad. Yeah, pretty much. Although, being too outspoken about SCDs being bad can end up being unintentionally pressure and shame for people who have made mistakes in the past, and there's not much they can do about it now. SCDs are bad, but people who have SCDs aren't awful people for existing, you know? So please don't be too mean to Mona mains, okay? Anyways, how did we go from Mona to STD? Because someone asked about standard characters, but they abbreviated it to STD. Anyways, Kutsing is an interesting unit. Because, like, she's kind of just, like, there. Like, she's not particularly good, but Fischl is. And so her teams can still clear. The biggest problem tends to be that Hyperbloom teams are so often just outright better than Aggravate teams. And with so many new carries not really wanting Xingqiu, it's very likely your Xingqiu is available for a Hyperbloom team. And so it becomes harder and harder for me to ever recommend Kutsing. Yeah. Then Tifnari is, like, arguably the best standard character for the average player. His teams can be dank to play properly, but if you are playing them properly, they're actually reasonable teams. They're pretty solid. His biggest problem is that he's single target oriented, which hasn't been that big of a deal lately, but could always go back to being a big deal. I mean, fuck, Next Abyss is a fucking Venti Abyss, so yeah. But yeah. And then finally, Dehya, who is maybe the second best standard right now. Basically, Hoyo releasing so many units, so many carries that want to do rotations shorter than 20 seconds, and that want Bennett, and that don't necessarily have a great last slot, is really good for Dehya. Because, like, yeah, her E cooldown is 20 seconds, but her build literally doesn't fucking matter, so you can put her on sack and you don't get punished for it at all. So she isn't actually a 20-second cooldown character. And a lot of characters, like, having sub 20-second rotations makes them a lot worse with Xiangling. And because they tend to, like, not have a great last slot, being able to get power resonance plus defensive utility tends to be, like, honestly pretty solid. I think Dehya is cool for Milani, but okay for Kanish. That's it right now. Yeah. I think the way I look at it is, like, standard characters are... None of the standard characters are, like, really good enough that they'll ever be part of anyone's optimal teams. And so it doesn't really matter how they perform in optimal teams nearly as much as how much they help your early stage team building when you don't have that many units yet. And with that in mind, Dehya is a unit that can be useful in Kanish teams and Milani teams, but also in Neuvillette teams. Although I guess Lanyan has made this a little more sus. Everyone is good in Neuvillette teams. Yeah, but having a defensive utility character that's not reliant on energy for Neuvillette teams tends to be nice. But like I just said, because of Lanyan, I don't know if that's really the case anymore anyways. But yeah, when you compare Yumemizuki Glorb to those units, she's probably above average for standard characters. The biggest issue with her is that animal characters, especially EM-focused animal characters, are so much worse than single target. You pretty much end up doing less than half your damage. You need other 5-stars for her teams. That's not necessarily true. Like, that's half true. Unironically, double animal burning with Kole is going to be a pretty decent option for AoE content for low investment clears. Aggravate is just better. It can be. It's gonna depend on the situation. Double animal aggravate is the only thing that comes to mind. The issue with double animal aggravate is that Yumemizuki Glorb doesn't have any absorption. And what that means is that whenever your off-field Dendro character triggers Quicken, you can end up losing your Electro Aura, and then you will do Windy Plant. Because Official A4 doesn't proc off of off-field Dendro characters triggering reactions. So I'm a little worried for the consistency. In AoE, you should be fine because the Electro Aura should be big enough to still have some underlying aura. Wait, suddenly I'm not sure anymore. If you apply Dendro to a big Electro Aura, you keep underlying Electro? Wait, I'm not sure anymore. I need to double check.
Come with me.
I think so, but I'm not sure. Yeah, okay, you do. Alright, we're vibing. I take a look at my enormous penis, and my troubles start melting away. I take a look at my enormous penis, and the happy times are coming to stay. I gotta sing and I dance when I glance in my pants, and the feeling's like a sunshiny day. I take a look at my enormous penis, and everything is going my way.